And hello and welcome back, everybody. And today we're really going to talk about the basics, foundations of traditional Eastern medicine. And so we're going to start today with really the most important concept is this idea of yin yang. A lot of people have talked about it, but no one really kind of gotten deeper into this relationship of what these two primordial forces have, right? And so today we'll talk about it and how that really actually impacts our health in medicine. So, one of the major books or textbooks that we actually work with is called The Yellow Emperor's Classic of Medicine. And it's basically this yellow emperor who's known as the Yellow Emperor, not because he was just yellow, but it was, I think, during a time when they considered the period to be yellow. And one of the main things that he did is actually brought a lot of medicine men together and really created a book that was able to record a lot of the similar things that many of the medicine men at the time were able to gather and experience and were using actually in their medicine. So one of the major quotes is, "The law of yin and yang is the natural order of the universe, the foundation of all things, the mother of all changes, and the root of life and death." And so I'd like to explain how the yin yang principles actually have very similar concept to what we have in the West called the seven hermetic principles. And we're only really going to touch up into three of those principles, right? The principle of polarity, where everything is dual, opposites are identical in natures, but they differ in degrees, right? And so these paradoxes can actually be reconciled because they both exist. And then the principle of rhythm. Everything flows out and in, rhythm compensates, right? This is the idea of breathing in, breathing out, is this concept of rhythm. And then finally, the principle of gender, which, funny today, it's a very controversial topic of debate. So I'm excited to not today talk about this concept or go further into the idea of gender in our next episode. However, today, yin yang is basically gender. It is basically this masculine and feminine principles that really manifest in our reality. So we'll go deeper into that concept. Okay, so the main five traits of yin and yang is this idea of opposition. We talked about this a little bit with polarity, the idea of interdependence, that they're actually needed for each other, and then this idea of mutual consuming. So when one is consumed, the other kind of is consumed as well. So they're actually always being consumed together. And then this transformational energy where actually yin and yang can transform into each other. And then finally, the infinite divisible concept, right, where everything can be continuously divisible by this whole idea of the relative yin and yang in any concepts. And so the most important concept is polarity, right? And we see this constantly. I think a lot of times in our own culture, we have struggled with allowing both polarities to exist, where we sometimes kind of say, hey, this or that, right? And that tends to be a very Western concept. However, in the East, we believe that this and that can exist at the same time. And so we experience it in this concept of in nature, and I'm going to talk about how we experience it in our own diagnosis of the body and how we can recognize these different patterns in our health. So in nature, you see this a lot, fire and water, right? The idea of fire, also fire cannot be touched. You cannot hold it, while water you can. So it kind of represents, going down further, it's the idea of energy, of matter, right? The sun and the moon, right? The sun represents kind of this beautiful heat that warms us up, but the moon, it's not cold per se, right? But it's the aspect of lack of the heat of the sun, but then the moon is reflecting back just this pure light, right? So it's a little different polarities. We talk about time and space, east, west, south, north, left and right. But really the main concepts that I want you all to understand is it's actually the difference is yang is immaterial. You cannot grasp it, you cannot touch it. It is this formless energy that just moves in the world, or is changing or forcing change in the world. Versus yin is this aspect of material physicalness, right? Where you can actually touch the yin, you can actually feel the yin, and you can put it in your hands and feel it, right? So that's the difference between the two in nature. Now in diagnosis, this is kind of what we talk about when we have someone come in and we look at their body, we ask them questions. We're really trying to see what is happening within the yin and the yang within their body, right? And so a lot of times yang energy shows up in the exterior, where if you're having a lot of this exterior problem, so sun damage, right? Burning, what's called sun irritation, it's all exterior. Versus like eating something that gives you food poisoning might be more of an interior problem, right? Because it's happening internal in your body. So some things that we check for is, are you hot or are you cold? Do you have an excess condition where there's an exuberance of energy versus a deficiency where you're just a little tired and you don't want to do anything? Or we have this restless energy where all you want to do is do so much, right? You get all excited, but then after that, you want to rest and you want to be quiet, right? And so we tend to see that when people are like, "Oh, you're such a quiet person," that tends to have a yin characteristics, right? And so these are things that we also pay attention to in our clinic. When you come in, are you the one who's just over talking when I'm asking questions, or are you the one who like barely answers a question, right? So those things are what we check for. Also, this idea of a red face or pale face, right? Red face, we tend to really resonate with the idea that people are probably upset or they're probably embarrassed or there's a lot of blood coming to the face. Compared to when you have a pale face, when you're like frightened that you saw a ghost or something, right? And so it shows that you have either this very young, exuberant energy or possibly a pathology or yin pathology where maybe you're more afraid, you're scared. We see that in either the shallow breathing when you're like shallowly breathing and you're scared, but then there could be this coarse breathing when you just ran 30 yards and then you're like really breathing deeply because you're trying to take more oxygen in. Okay? So in general, in all of nature and everything, even in our body, everything has this concept of yin and yang, right? The polarity and the gender. And so one of the major things that we talk about is this interdependence, that yin is a nutrient substance while yang is a functional activity. And without the structure of yin, you don't have yang. And so we see it in, like, let's say cars, right? The yin is the fuel, right? The gasoline that you put into the car. But the fact that the car can drive because it has fuel is considered yang, right? So if you say, hey, the car doesn't work, that means that it's not able to move, so it's lacking of yang. But then you find out you actually don't have gasoline in it, you're actually missing yin. So because without yin, you cannot actually make the car move, right? However, in medicine, what we look at that is we actually have these two types of organs. We have these yin organs and the yang organs, which I will talk more deeply in another episode. But this idea that these yin organs actually stores liquids, right? Stores fuel for our body. We see that in the blood is the fuel that moves the activities in our body, right? So the yang organs then tend to produce qi and blood, and we'll talk about what qi is, but this concept that qi and blood is part of the yang organs, and they're using that energy to sustain us, right? So the reason why after we eat, and so yang organs are actually connected to digestion. Why? Because digestion is where you eat and then you get the energy, right? After you eat, you get so much energy, you want to do stuff. So because of that, these organs are actually producing this energy that allows you to want to talk, to want to dance, to want to play, just this energy that you feel after you eat. So these yang organs depend so much also on the yin organs because that's actually what nourishes the body for movement, right? So it's almost like when you're in the sun and you oversweat, you run out of this fluid. And so what happened is your body gets a little tight because you've run out of fluids, right? So the yang organs, you had all this energy to do stuff, but because you've been depleting because you're moving so much, the yin organs start to deplete. So that's kind of, you see that they're interdependent. They need each other to function in our own life. And so we experience it actually in the West, and we've heard this in many spiritual concepts. As you probably heard of Mother Gaia, we talk about Mother Earth being the physical representation of our reality, where everything that we build from wood, soil, cement, bricks, metal, all that is the physical form of the Mother Earth energy, the Mother Gaia energy, right? And so we experience that as water, earth, the material force. We are considered a material force, right? If we have a body, we're considered built from earth, right? However, this is kind of the difference where Father Sky comes in. He's the air, the fire, the weather, and the weather and how the weather changes allows for the material to also shift, right? When the air becomes like a cyclone and thunder, it moves the things in the earth, right? And so it shows how there's a relationship between this invisible force that has energy but doesn't have physical force, a physical matter versus Mother Gaia who has this physical matter. And so the idea is when the two merge, they are actually creating us as the human force. And so in Chinese medicine, we talk about the heaven layer, which is this Father Sky, and the Mother Earth energy, which is on our feet. But we are the human layer in the middle, which is this convergence of the two energies that we are ourselves bringing in harmony inside of our body. And so the next piece is really this idea of mutual consumption, and we use this a lot. A lot of our own practice requires us to understand this whole concept of excess heat, excess cold, deficiency heat, deficient cold, to understand what is happening in the body, because then from there we're able to understand which organs, which constitutions you're having, or what could be happening to your body that's causing some of these problems. And so one of the major things we always talk about is this balance of yin yang. In Western medicine, we call it homeostasis. And so when you have an excess of anything, and so in the East, cold is an absence of heat, like thermic energy, what we talk about in physics of the West, but rather yin is its own separate force. The cold has its force. It is not an absence of heat. It is literally its own power of coldness, right? And so when we have these, when the energies of yin yang are not in balance, you start to express some of the surplus of this energy. And so when you have a surplus of this heat, of this yang energy, you we call it excess heat, right? That it is consuming a lot of yang energy. Your body is consuming a lot of yang energy. We see it a lot in the summer when we start to sweat. We start to have a lot of exuberant heat inside of us, and that's why we sweat. Versus excess cold happens obviously during the winters when the weather is much colder outside, and you do get this exuberance of or surplus of cold happening around us, and that's why we wear like 10 coats to support ourselves, right? Because there's so much cold that's trying to come inside of our bodies, right? And so we call that the excess cold. So those make sense, right? But this is kind of where it gets a little tricky, and this is why it's a very interesting concept that yin and yang is always playing this balance of homeostasis, right? And so because of that, we never say that if you have more yang, then you have no yin. Like this, literally, if one disappears, if there's no yin or no yang, and any of them, you are considered dead in medicine, right? So obviously, that's very important for us to gauge. Is we're trying to gauge: are you now low in yin or low in yang? Because we have to support the supply. Otherwise, if any of those supplies go down to zero, you are experiencing death. So as doctors, it was very important for us to make sure that your surplus of both of these energies were never going below a detrimental space, okay? So deficiency heat, we experience this a lot is when during the summer when we sweat a lot, our yin is our fluids. And when the fluids become underbalanced, where you have maybe 80% of fluids in your body, like 80% of gas, 80% gasoline may not sound a lot, but like let's say you're half a tank, right? And so at that point, what happens is your car, okay, that's not a very good analogy, but this idea is when you actually run out of sweat, we see this in heat strokes a lot. When you can no longer sweat because you've been sweating for so long that the sweat runs out, then what happens is your relative energy or relative temperature will be really hot. Not really hot, it's just mildly hot, right? When we experience a really high fever where it's like, oh my God, you're 105 degrees, 110 degrees, that's super hot. That's a very excessive hot. But what we experience sometimes deficiency heat, you experience more like 100, 101 degree fever, but it's not so hot that like you're burning up, but you're actually feeling warm, very warm. And what you'll notice, your mouth will be dry. Everything that in this case, usually maybe you ran out of sweat, and that's why you're considered deficiency heat, right? You are hot, but you're deficiently hot because you're deficient in the opposite element, which is yin. And then deficient cold is basically the opposite, where when you are running out of yang energy. So we talk about like when people are like low in energy and they speak very softly, we consider them a yang deficient because they just don't have enough energy to speak up very loudly, right? And you can see this where a lot of yin energy is still in balance, but the yang has been kind of reduced. So actually overworking, doing a lot, you've been working more than 8 hours, your yang will usually kind of shrink, right, to the point where it will become less filled, and then yin, you might feel actually really cold at work, right, where we all blast AC like crazy here, especially in Texas where I'm at, and so this, all this excess liquids that you have with the air conditioning would make you feel really cold because you actually don't have enough energy to keep yourself warm. Right, so those are very important because we constantly use these two concepts in clinic, and we're trying really hard to find ways to speak in a way that you understand, because these concepts, even when we are like 2-3 years in medicine, we have to kind of like do two steps in our head to remember, because you're hot, but then the problem is the yin, right? So it's the opposite element that is in deficiency, but you are experiencing the opposite temperature effect. Hope that made sense. It's quite a trick to remember. And so in deeper conversations in nature, in summertime, this is kind of what I was saying, when it's hot like yang and we sweat a lot, which is your yin, the fluids, right, the liquid, the material itself, then the external temperature is very cold. Oh, I'm sorry. And then when you experience the cold, like in the winter, then the body starts to tremble, and that's the yang. The yang energy is trying to move, but what happened is actually, as you can see, when liquids become cold, they actually start to, in physics, they come together and they start to congeal, right? Like blood, if you've seen blood when it's cold, it looks like jello, right? And that jello makes it really hard for blood to go through the body. And so the yang energy is trying to warm up, and so it's trembling to give you this energy to heat up so that you can kind of overtake the cold that's happening to you. And in medicine, this is kind of our concept of what we sometimes say, oh, you tend to be yang deficient or yin deficient. And one of the major Western ailments that this describes is hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism, right? Hyperthyroidism is kind of this exuberant yang energy, but it's because you're lacking of the yin. And then the same is when you are hypothyroid, it happens that you actually low in the energy, and then you have an exuberant of, or you have normal levels of liquids, right? And so because of that, the heat is not able to overtake the liquid, causing you to feel always cold and not want to do anything. And finally, actually not finally, and the next step is enter transformation. So this is the idea that yin yang actually have the ability to transform into each other, and then there's this cycle that these elements constantly transform, and we see this in this idea of rhythms, right? So when the day turns into night and back to day, this is the rhythm of life cycles. When we're excessively working and we're not resting, we're inducing extreme deficiency in the body's liquids, right? When we're jogging too much, a lot of times we call that ultra marathoners or triathlons, which I've done, you start to actually spend so much energy doing an activity that you start to have a very slow pulse, right? And so because you're actually running out of the liquid itself. And in medicine, exterior cold, this is kind of like, again, the weather coming in and invading the body after a certain amount of time, and that's turning then. So this is kind of what you experience, the chills and fevers. The cold is coming in, making you chills, but if it is able to go deeper into the body, actually, this is what we say inflammation, right? The immune system is fighting the disease, and that fighting causes this heat that's happening in you. And so suddenly you start to sweat and you start to feel this fever, but then your body remembers, hey, we're still cold on the outside, so suddenly you switch and you have the chills, and then after a while you start realizing, oh yeah, my body's fighting internally, so you kind of go back and forth. And we've talked about this as the idea of alternative chills and fever as you are getting a cold or warm attack going into the body. And so this deeper transformation or rhythm that happens is we can see it in a 24-hour cycle clock. And so this is kind of where the yin yang symbol is represented here, where we can start here with a rising yang at 6 a.m. in the morning, right? We're kind of rising to this exuberant heat. We're seeing the sun kind of rise. So the sun is this idea of yang, and the moon is this idea of yin. So when the sun is rising at 6 a.m. in the morning, we see this beautiful sunset. It's still not so hot, right? But when do we experience the most heat is where the sun is directly above us, right? Usually during the 12 p.m. time. And then after that 12 p.m. time, we actually start to see the yin itself, and you can see it through this black dot, is now born within this extra yang, right? That 12 p.m. is so much yang, so now at 1 p.m., 2 p.m., you start to see the yin energy that is a seed within the yang is starting to sprout, causing this now rebalancing where the yin within is turning into a bigger yin, and the yang that we've been experiencing is starting to slow down and reduce itself. And so now we're getting closer to the 6 p.m. time where we're seeing the sunset. And at the sunset, you are seeing the yang kind of going to sleep, and then the yin is starting to rise up, which is getting a lot, usually cooler nights. And this is then where we see the rising yin from 6 p.m. To 12 a.m., where, as we all know, we then see the moon exactly above us in the sky, and that's when we know that we've reached 12 a.m., right? Where we have the most yin in the day. And in that most yin in the day is when the beginning of the sun is starting to come back around, right? And so we have this white dot here representing that the yang energy is now a seed and is getting ready to germinate back into the outside world, where now we experience from 12 to 6 a.m. the beginning of the sun rising back out, transforming from cold to hot and into the rising yang. And this also represents the 4 seasons, right? So here in the early daytime, we have the spring, summer being the hottest time, fall being the beginning of the cold coming in, and finally winter being exuberantly cold outside, okay? So that is this rhythm, and that is also this idea of transformation. And finally, the last piece is the idea that this yin-yang concept is not static. It is the way that we relate energies to themselves so that we can constantly divide everything to this relative yin and yang. And so in the idea of temperatures, obviously cold is yin, yang is hot. However, during the winter, where everything is cold, then you also still have a relative concept that when it's frozen in ice, you're probably talking about yin, right? And even the idea of ice is physical. But then maybe like it's not cold enough to turn into ice, but it's cold where you're wearing 2 jackets, right? That's considered yang compared to the frozen ice cube, right? And so this is kind of this idea that we should not be stuck to this is going to be yang forever, this is going to be yin forever. Actually, it will kind of transform into each other, and maybe relatively in a phase, some of it may become yang, some of it may become more yin, right? So it's really actually we experience this in the masculine men, right, versus the more feminine men, versus the masculine women versus the feminine women, right? Even in this concept of describing women, you can say that the women that maybe are more athletic, more driven, tend to have more of this masculine yang energy compared to women that tend to be much more quiet, much more passive, or just not speaking up as much. She tends to maybe have a more of a feminine aspect of a feminine energy already, right? So she's more yin than another masculine woman who is more yang. And finally, in the body, we also describe this as the front of our body is considered yin. And this is kind of where we protect ourselves, right? When we go to the fetus position, we're protecting this front section, right? Because the back here is where we see kind of our spine, and it's kind of usually protected. And this is why you see the skin is darker here, because it's taking a lot of this force of the weather compared to here in the front of our body, it's lighter, right? And so that's more yin. However, when we talk about the front and the back, where yang is the back, however, in the front here, this middle section here might be more yin compared to up here, right? When heat rises, it's going to rise to the top of the head, to the body here. And so this is considered yang relative to the body, to the bottom of the front of the trunk, which is more yin, okay? And so in conclusion, Yin and Yang are the primordial forces that moves everything in the world inside of us and outside of us, right? And this is kind of why it's important to recognize the balance, the homeostasis between these two energies, because when these energies start to separate, you are going to experience a polarity of hot and cold. Some of us have experiences, I mean, just the idea of being sick, you are sometimes experiencing fevers and chills at the same time, is because the energies are separating. And eventually, as you know, as we get deeper and deeper into fever, into a cold flu, and it goes deeper into our body, it starts to separate the yin yang, and this is kind of why some people might die from the flu, right? Because the internal body is just losing its ability to rebalance itself through homeostasis. So this is kind of the basics of yin and yang. I will definitely, on our next episode, we're going to go through the pathology, the idea of gender. I think this is a very deep conversation though, that it requires a little bit more conversations around. So please stay tuned. I'm hoping to have these episodes, every 2 to 3 days as I'm studying myself, studying for the boards, and really trying to integrate this information deeper into my studies. However, the whole concept is I want to have a relationship with my patients. I really want them to understand what is it that I'm trying to share with them, because a lot of times today in medicine, people just come in and say, hey, what's wrong with me? Tell me what I need to do, and then I'll go home and do it. And what happens is actually we're taking away the power that we have to know what's happening to our bodies, to recognize that, and to actually be the one in charge of our physical health. And so it's very important that I'm having this conversation with all my patients, that they understand the concept of yin yang, and that just because they're a woman or a man, that they have both of these elements inside of them, and it's about finding this balance within them. And so they could be doing things at home that could be supporting themselves, so that when they do come back to my clinic, we are having a deeper discussion on how are they doing in their life, so I can help them kind of keep building their self-healing process, right? Because in general, I'm putting needles in places that your organs, your body, and your yin and yang is trying to come into homeostasis, into balance. I'm not doing it myself. I'm just recognizing what's happening to you from the diagnosis of your body, the reflection that your body is sharing with me, and I'm putting needles in the places that your body needs those needles to be at, so that the body itself is doing the healing. So it's very important that we are coming from the same page conversation. I hope that you had some insight on your body and how the masculine and feminine energies and the polarities and the rhythm within you are always in action. So please subscribe, follow this channel. I'm very excited to be putting more things around acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat below. This is new to me, so I'm still trying to figure out the right language to speak to you all. But please write out questions. I will definitely answer them. And if I need a whole lecture to answer them, I will create a whole lecture. Not a lecture, but this idea of conversation with you all. Okay? So you guys have a great day. Please continue your journey of self-healing, and I'll see you next time. Bye.